In this ASMR episode, I will read for you Captain Underpants, and this is the 6th epic novel by Dave Pilkey. R-S-M-R Katz. Hello my little mouses, and welcome back to a new episode here on my ASMR channel. I already wrote for you like 5 books from Captain Underpants, so I can recommend you to begin at the start to get the story full at the end. And this is now the 6th book I will read for you. So feel free to check all the other videos I have in my playlist, and also to keep track with all the other books from Captain Underpants I wrote before. And feel free to subscribe to my YouTube channel, to click on the notification bell and to follow me, because I am a tattoo girl who show you the satisfaction of ASMR sound. And it's sometimes so minimalistic, but it can make a big difference when you put, like I do, some quality inside. Maybe you already recognize me because the World Wide Web is my playground, so I have a lot of different projects. So if you not already do, click yourself through the full World Wide Web to find me and see what I have to offer. Everything for your satisfaction and in the best quality. When you ask yourself why I have my headphones in, it is because here and here you can see a high quality recording. So if you lean back and want to enjoy, then just put your headphones in and listen to the crystal clear sound I have to offer for you. Always feel free to support me with your comments under this video. Maybe you already know that book. Let me know where you read it the first time or heard about it the first time. And yeah, I'm always happy about every thought you can write down in the comments to support me and let my heart projects grow. So let's start. I hope you have made yourself comfortable and cozy, that I can start now to read for you the book Captain Underpants and the Big Bad Battle of the Bionic Booger Boy, Part 1, The Night of the Nasty Nostril Nuggets. It is the 6th epic novel by Dave Pilkey. Hey everybody, and welcome another one of our disastrous misadventures. Before we got started, check out the comic book to get the full scoop on our story so far. George and Harold proudly present The Awful Truth About Captain Underpants, a Treehouse Comics production. Once upon a time, there was a cool kids named George and Harold. They had a mean old principal named Mr Krupp. One time, Mr Krupp punished George and Harold, so they got a 3D hypno-ring and hypnotized him. They made him think he was a superhero. It was supposed to be a joke, but it got carried too far. Way too far. Then one day he got attacked by a dandelion. So George stole some superpower juice from a UFO and gave it to him. Suddenly he got superpowers. Nowadays, whenever Mr. Krupp hears anybody snap their fingers, he turns into you know who. And the only way you can stop him is if you pour water on his head. Then he turns back into Mr. Krupp. So whatever you do, don't snap your fingers around Mr. Krupp, okay? Chapter 1. George and Harold. This is George Beard and Harold Hutchins. George is the kid on the left with the tie and the flat top. Harold is the one on the right with the t-shirt and the bad haircut. Remember that now. George's and Harold's grades in school were much like whales in the ocean. They rarely rose above sea level. Melvin's neatly, however, he's the kid down there with the bow tie and the glasses, always got straight A's. Because Melvin was so academically gifted, people just assumed he was a lot smarter than George and Harold. But that wasn't true. You see, George and Harold were every bit as smart as the straight A students, but in a different way. In a way that couldn't be measured by quizzes or worksheets. Maybe George and Harold couldn't spell very well or remember their multifunctional tables. Perhaps their grammar weren't no good neither, but when it came to saving the entire planet from the nasty forces of unrelating evil, there was nobody better than George Beard and Harold Hutchins. It's a good thing that George and Harold were smart enough to get themselves out of trouble, because their silliness was always getting them into trouble. In fact, one time it got them into a really snooty situation. But before I can tell you that story, I have to tell you this. Chapter 2. Squishies, Part 1. It was demonstration speech day in Mrs. Ribble's 4th grade English class. Every student had to give an oral report demonstrating how to do something. First up were Tim Bronsky and Steve Lubner, who demonstrated how to give a speech that they hadn't prepared for. They got a D-. Next up were Jessie Gordon and Stephanie Wyckoff, who demonstrated how to cook frozen lasagna in a pop-up toaster. After the firemen left, it was George and Harold's turn. Harold carefully attached some charts on graphs on the tall wall. George brought out a large garbage can with a lot toilet seat taped on top. "Ladies and gentlemen," said George, "today Harold and I are going to demonstrate how to do a squishy. First, you need 2 packs of ketchup and a toilet seat. Next," said Harold as he pointed to the display chart, "you must fold the ketchup packs in half and carefully place them under the toilet seat. Make sure that the packs are under those front 2 bumpy thingies on the bottom of the seat. Now, once the ketchup packs are in place," said Harold, "all you have to do is wait for somebody to sit down on the toilet seat. Do we have any volunteers?" "Come on," said George. "Who wants to squishy?" Also, nobody in the class wanted to sit on a toilet seat. Everybody wanted to see what would happen if somebody actually did. So George grasped on the side of the toilet seat. Harold grasped the other, and together they pushed it down. Splash! Everyone in the class was thrilled, except for the kids sitting directly in front of the toilet seats. who were somewhat less than thrilled. "Hooray for Squishies!" the children shouted. Now, normally George and Harold's teacher, Mrs. Ribble, would have been very angry about this particular demonstration speech. She would have yelled on and on about inimitable behavior and how it's not nice to spray ketchup into people's underwear. But Mrs. Ribble had changed quite a bit since the last book, and now she was all about fun. "Come on, kids," shouted Miss Ribble. "Let's all around to the cafeteria and grab some ketchup packs. Squishies for everybody." "Hooray!" cried the children as they bounded from their seats and dashed towards the classroom door. "Not so fast," shouted Melvin neatly, who stood blocking the door with the arms spread defiantly. "You guys are so immature." Chapter 3. The Combine-O-Tron 2000. Melvin Sneedly, the school brainiac, was not about to let anybody leave the classroom until he had given his demonstration speech. "We still have 50 minutes left before lunch," said Melvin, "and that's just enough time for me to demonstrate my new invention, the Combine-O-Tron 2000. "Oh man," whined Melvin's classmates. The children all slumped back into their seats, while Melvin pushed a plastic rolling cart to the front of the classroom. On top of the cart were a hamster, a small robot, which Melvin had built himself, and a strange-looking contraption shaped like an ice cream cone. "Today," said Melvin, "I will demonstrate how to turn an ordinary hamster into your very own bionic cyberslave." Melvin placed his pet hamster Zulu at one end of the cart, and his tiny homemade robot at the other end. "I shall now combine the ordinary hamster with the tiny robot using the Combine-O-Tron 2000. Melvin picked up the Combine-O-Tron 2000 and turned it on. A high-pitched tone pierced the classroom air, getting higher and higher in frequency as the machine charged to full power. Melvin typed some last-minute calculations into the keyboard and the side of the Combine-O-Tron 2000 as its laser extractor warmed up. Suddenly, two streaks of red glowing light flashed on the Zulu and the tiny robot. The Combine-O-Tron 2000 began assimilating information on the two elements it was about to combine. "Don't worry, kids," said Melvin. "This procedure is totally painless. Zulu won't feel anything." Finally, a computerized voice started the countdown. "Combining two elements in 5 seconds. Combining the elements in 4 seconds. Combining the elements in 3 seconds. Combining the elements in 2 seconds. Combining the elements in 1 second. Bzzz. A burst of brilliant white light shot out of the Combine-O-Tron 2000 and formed the ball of energy between Zulu and the tiny robot. The hamster and the robot began to slide closer and closer together until they disappeared into the energy ball. The smell of burnt matches and pickle relish filled the air as hot blasts of electric wind knocked books off shelves and sent papers flying. Suddenly, there was a blinding flash of light, a quick puff of smoke, and it was all over. Melvin put off his goggles. No longer were hamster and robot sitting on the cart before him. Now the hamster and robot were one, combined at a calcular level. The world's first self-contained, warm-blooded, fuzzy bionic cyborg. "Eureka!" shouted Melvin. "It worked! I have created its cybernetic life form." The children looked on as Melvin waved a metal detector over the hamster and the reading went off the charge. One of the children raised his hand with a question. "Yes," said Melvin enthusiastically. "Can we go to the lunchroom and get the ketchup packs now?" "No," screamed Melvin. "Will you forget about Squishies for 1 minute? I've just created the world's first cybernetic hamster, and nobody is leaving this room until I've demonstrated his undying obedience." Chapter 4. Bad Zulu. Zulu didn't seem to know that he had just undergone a groundbreaking transformation. He didn't act any different. He just wandered across the top of the plastic rolling cart, sniffing everything around him, only stopping occasionally to scratch his ears or rub his whiskers. But poor Zulu was in for big surprise. "Zulu," said Melvin, "I am your master and you will obey my commands. I want you to demonstrate your new powers for the class. Do a super bionic jump across the room." Zulu didn't respond. "Zulu," said Melvin sternly, "crush that plastic rolling cart in your bare paws." Zulu did not respond. "Zulu," Melvin shouted, "go outside, pick up a car, and throw it across the parking lot." Zulu didn't respond. Finally, Melvin reached into his book bag and took out a red ping-pong paddle he had designed especially for the occasion. "Zulu," he said angrily, "do as I say or you are going to get a good spanking." This time, Zulu did respond. When he saw the ping-pong paddle, he became very frightened and his little hamster instinct took over. Zulu jumped into the air, grabbed the ping-pong paddle in his right paw, and then yanked Melvin onto the plastic rolling cart with his left paw. The children finally stopped thinking about ketchup packs and toilets for a moment and settled in to watch the show. Chapter 5. The Incredible Graphic Violence Chapter Part 1 in Flipporama. Warning. The following chapter contains graphic depictions of a mean little boy getting spanked by a bionic hamster. While this event is presented for humor's effect, the producer of this book acknowledged that hamster attacks are no laughing matter. If you are someone you love has been the victim of a hamster attack, we strongly urge you to get help by seeking out the local support group in your area or by visiting. The problem with incredible graphic violence is that it's hardly ever fun. Well, all that has changed since the invention of Flipporama. Check it out. Spanks for the memories. Chapter 6. The Aftermath. Also, Zulu hadn't really spanked Melvin very hard. Melvin wailed and blubbered and carried on away. "You're a bad hamster," Melvin cried. "I will never want to see you again as long as I live." Melvin ran out of the classroom. The rest of the class, including Mrs. Ribble, followed him out, laughing and chanting, "Squishies! Squishies, squishies!" But George and Harold stayed behind to comfort the forgotten hamster. "Don't feel bad, Zulu," said George. "Melvin is real mean." "Yeah," said Harold. "Do you want to come home with us? You can live up in our treehouse." Zulu jumped on the Harold's shoulder and licked his face. Then he jumped over to George's shoulder and licked his face too. "I think we've just adopted a bionic hamster," said Harold. So George tucked their new paw into his shirt pocket and the three friends went off to lunch. Chapter 7. Mr. Krupp. About that very same time, the school principal, Mr. Krupp, came marching into the office in a particularly full mood. He stopped beside Miss Antrophy's desk, huffing and puffing. "Where's my coffee, Edith?" he shouted. "Get it yourself, Dewey," Miss Antro shouted back. "I don't need your lip today, woman," Mr. Krupp growled. "I just want my coffee, and I want it now." "Well, get me a cup too while you're at it," Miss Antrophy growled back. "Oh!" screamed Mr. Krupp in frustration as he grabbed a newspaper and headed for the faculty restroom. Miss Ribble was standing beside the restroom door, smiling and trying very hard not to laugh. "What are you looking at?" Mr. Krupp snarled as he pushed his way past Mrs. Ribble and slammed the restroom door behind him. Inside the restroom, you could hear the faint sound of belt buckle jingling, a zipper unzipping, some clothes rustling, and finally... Splash! "What the?" screamed Mr. Krupp from inside the restroom. "I've got ketchup in my underwear." In a few moments, the door of the faculty restroom flew open. "I'm going to get George and Harold for this," Mr. Krupp screamed. "They didn't do it," laughed Mrs. Ribble. "I did it. It's called a squishy. It's the lightest fat." "Yeah, right, very funny," said Mr. Krupp. "No, where are those kids? I just know they are responsible." As Mr. Krupp headed for the cafeteria, he noticed that he wasn't the only person to fall victim of the dreaded squishies. All through the hallway, angry first, second, third, fifth, and sixth graders were complaining about ketchup stains on their pants, socks, legs, and underwear. Mr. Krupp stormed into the cafeteria and headed for the fourth graders' table. "George and Harold," shouted Mr. Krupp, "I've got ketchup in my underwear because of you two, and so do half the kids in the school." "We didn't do it," said Harold. "Yeah," said a few of the other fourth graders. "George and Harold are innocent." "Oh no, they are not," said a voice from the other end of the table. It was Melvin's needle. Besides being the school brainiac, Melvin was also famous for being the school tattly. George and Harold taught everybody a trick today where you put ketchup bags under a toilet seat and make it spray on people's legs. Melvin reported it proudly. "Thank you, Melvin," said Mr. Krupp. He turned to George and Harold and pointed at the cafeteria door. Mr. Beard and Mr. Hutchins. Out. Chapter 8. The comic is mightier than the spitball. George and Harold were sent straight to the detain room. "Man," said Harold, "Melvin is such a tattler. Somebody ought to teach him a lesson. And we are just the guys to do it," said George. So George and Harold created an all-new comic book featuring everybody's favorite tattling meanie, Melvin's Needly. When they were done, the two boys sneaked out of the detain room to run off copies of their latest work and sell them into the hallway. The new comic book was a great success. Everybody loved it. Well, everybody but Melvin's Needly, I should say. As Melvin walked to his last class of the day, he noticed a small group of students in the hallway reading comics together and giggling. Normally, this was enough to make Melvin run straight to the principal's office and tell everyone for unsupervised reading, which was strictly forbidden. But today, Melvin noticed something strange. The coming reading students were pointing and laughing at him. "What?" said Melvin. "What's wrong? What are you guys laughing at?" Melvin looked around the hallway desperately. Everybody was laughing. Everybody was pointing, and it was driving Melvin crazy. He marched over to a group of second graders, grabbed the comic book out of their hands and looked at the cover. Melvin was furious. "You guys are so immature," shrieked Melvin. He quickly darted off to read the comic in peace, but everywhere he ran, he came across more pointing and more laughing. Finally, Melvin thought of the one place he could read the comic in private. He went into the boys' bathroom, looked himself in one of the stalls, and sat down to read. Splash! As Melvin sat reading, his legs dripping with ketchup, he became angrier and angrier. "I'm gonna get George and Harold," Melvin woofed. Chapter 9: Captain Underpants and the Terrifying Tale of the Tattletron 2000 by George Beard and Harold Hutchins. Once upon a time, there was a dumb kid named Melvin who was a big tattle. Everywhere he went, he caused grief and misery, until one day, "Cops, that guy just robbed the bank." "Gee, thanks, kid. You are under arrest." "Hey, kid, you solved the crime of the century." And so, Daily News. Dumb kid as hero. Everybody loves Melvin. Melvin had become so popular that he decided to run for the mayor. He won in a landslide victory. "Congratulations, you're the youngest mayor ever." "Yes, and I'm going to make some big changes." Soon Mayor Melvin made a bunch of dumb new laws, and people were getting arrested left and right. And they all get sent to jail. Suddenly, Mayor Melvin, all the jails are full. "I will build a big robo-jail and catch those lawbreakers myself." So he built the Tattletron 2000. Soon, Mayor Melvin was off catching lawbreakers. "That will teach you." Then Melvin headed for the school. "Help! The Tattletron 2000 just ran across the soccer field and squished the gym teacher." "Oh no. This looks like a job for Captain Underpants." "What's up?" "Look out. You're going to jail for busting the roof." But Captain Underpants was faster than a speeding waistband, more powerful than a boxer shorts, and able to leap tall buildings without getting a wedgie. Captain Underpants wanted to fight to the robot, but he didn't want to hurt the people inside. Then he got the idea. "What the? Oh. We are free! Ooh!" Soon there was nobody left inside the Tattletron 2000 except for Melvin. "I'm telling." And so, hooray for Captain Underpants. You guys are so immature. Chapter 10: Mad Mr. Melvin. Melvin was furious. He ripped the comic book in half and tossed it over his shoulder. Then he washed his hand in the toilet and stormed out of the restroom. "I'm gonna get George and Harold for that," said Melvin. "I'm gonna teach them a lesson they will never forget." After school, Melvin grabbed his comic Binotron 2000 and headed home. Melvin's mother and father were both busy working on top-secret government experiment when Melvin walked into the front door. "Hello, son," said Melvin's father. How was your day at school? Terrible, said Melvin. Nobody in school has sufficient respect for my beautiful mind. Those dull-witted, lame-brained, gum-chewing idiots are more impressed with comic books than they are with the wonders of science. But I shall teach them. I shall teach them all. That's nice, said Melvin's mom. Melvin marched up his room to begin building a brand new superpower robot. But when he opened his bedroom door, he saw the family's pet cat, Dandera, sleeping quiet on his bed. Hey, Melvin screamed. What are you doing in my room, you stupid cat? You know I'm allergic to you. Now get out. After a few hours, Melvin had built his newest and most powerful robot ever, which had 3 sets of intelligent laser eyeballs, macro-hydraulic jump-atronic legs, super somgo-bulting automa arms, and an extendable ecto-claw ribcage, and was powered by the 3 separate twin-turbo 9000 SP5 Kung Fu titanium lithium alloy processors, which were all built into a virtuality instruct reflexogromomanic endoskeleton that had the power to punch through cinder blocks, crush steel in its vexillic grasp, and plow mercilessly through poorly written run and sentences. It could also slice bagels. That ought to do the trick, said Melvin, wiping his nose and tissue. Now all I have to do is combine my body with the bionic robota, and shall be the most powerful boy who ever lived. Chapter 11. Melvin's Fantasy. As Melvin set up the Combinatron 2000 and made the proper adjustments, he imagined what his life would be like as the world's first bionic boy. He imagined himself walking into school the next day, his arms swinging confidently as he crashed through the classroom wall. The girls would swoon as Melvin talked for hours about the amazing world of science. Miss Ribble would probably let Melvin sit at her desk from now on, because Melvin's new buns of steel would be too massive to fit into the ordinary children's school. Maybe Mr. Krupp would invite the governor to visit the school so he could show off his smartest and most powerful student. If so, the governor would probably declare a new holiday, National Melvin's Needly Day, a day when kids all over the world would get extra homework and pop squeezes to honor the glorious name of Melvin. But the best part of all would be George and Harold's reaction. They would be so terrified by Melvin's incredible size and the strength, they dropped to their knees and begged for mercy. And Melvin would spare them only if they agreed to be his slaves for all eternity. They'd have to carry his books, sharpen his pencils, and be his personal footstools during each class. Life is gonna rule, said Melvin. Chapter 12. The Night of the Nasty Nostril Nuggets. Melvin turned on the Combinatron 2000. A high-pitched tone pierced the air, getting higher and higher in frequency as the machine charged to full power. Oops, said Melvin as he quickly turned the dramatic effect setting to off, so he wouldn't disturb his parents. Silently, the machine continued to charge as Melvin entire calculation to account for his clothes and glasses. When the laser extractor had finally warmed up, Melvin stepped in front of the Combinatron 2000, standing perfectly still beside his new robot. Suddenly, 2 streaks of red glowing light flashed on Melvin and the robot as the Combinatron 2000 began assimilating information on the 2 elements it was about to combine. Finally, a computerized voice started the countdown, combining the elements in 5 seconds. Melvin stood perfectly still. Combining 2 elements in 4 seconds. Melvin's nose began to twitch. Combining 2 elements in 3 seconds. Suddenly, Melvin felt an uncontrollable urge. He cupped his hands over his mouth and nose as his eyes squeezed closer, involuntarily. Combine 2 elements in 2 seconds. Achoo! Melvin looked down into his hands, which were now glistening with mucus and crusty chunks of semi-dried boogles. Instantly, the Combinotron 2000 began to recalculate the elements in its laser sights, combining 3 elements in 1 second. 3 elements? Melvin screamed in horror. What's the third element? Quickly, Melvin's eyes darted around the room, searching for any new element that might have accidentally made it was into the side of the laser extractor. What's the third element? He screamed again. Then he looked down into his crusty, dripping, filled hands. Oh no, said Melvin as a blinding burst of white light engulfed him. Chapter 13. The next day. The next day, Melvin didn't show up for school on time. Nobody really seemed to notice, so because all the children were excited about the show and tell. Almost everyone had brought in really lame stuff like books or awards, but George and Harold had something that was totally cool. Everybody remembers Zulu from yesterday, right? We took him home to live with us in our treehouse, and we taught him the greatest trick, said Harold. The 2 boys carried Zulu over to the classroom window and opened it up. Harold pulled a large watermelon out of his book bag and showed it to Zulu. Okay, Zulu, said George, show everybody your new trick. In one swift motion, Zulu placed his mouth on the watermelon and shoved the entire thing into his left cheek. The 4th graders were stunned. No, said Harold, that's not the trick. The trick is what happened next. Zulu looked out the window and eyed a dead tree at the far end of the empty playground. Zulu began to chew up the watermelon, then pucked his tiny hamster lips and spat. The watermelon seeds fired out of Zulu's mouth, hitting their target with expert precision. No time at all, the dead tree at the end of the playground was reduced to a pile of twigs and sawdust. The class cheered as George and Harold patted their amazing little bionic body. George and Harold didn't think that anybody could beat their show and tell display, but they were wrong, because all that very moment, Melvin's needle was dripping down the hallway towards the classroom door. Melvin hadn't bought anything for show and tell. Melvin was the show and tell. Chapter 14. The unnecessary, disgusting chapter. Notice, the following chapter is extremely gross. To avoid nausea, projectile vomiting, or other gastrointestinal unpleasantries, please refrain from eating for at least 1 hour before reading this chapter. You won't want to eat after reading it, let me assure you. All of the 4th graders were cheering and pretting Zulu as the classroom door slowly opened. A greenish, glistening beam entered the room, filling the air with the sound of grinding metal gears and wet, gooey, bursting bubbles. Some of the girls screamed. Some of the boys did too. You guys are so immature, said the horrible beast. At once, the children recognized the terrifying creature that stood before them. Melvin, they cried. Yes, it's me, gurgled the wet jiggling monster angrily. His eyes and nose were dripping with warm greenish custard-like mucus. His robotic arms were caked with massive globs of crispy shimmering snot. As he turned to close the classroom door behind him, part of his hand came off on the doorknob. It oozed slowly down the door, leaving behind a chunky trail of moist exharation. Melvin squeaked and sloshed as he jiggled over the store chair. Each gooey footstep coated the floor with a foamy trail of slime, and everything he touched became wet and encrusted with warm bubbling syrup. When Melvin sat down, generous helpings of jellish bubbling like goo slowly dribbled down the chair, collecting into creamy, granulous puddles beneath him. The puddles themselves were slightly transported and specked with thick, shrimming nose hairs and dark red chunks of cocolet blood which— "All right already," yelled George, said the narrator. "Enough with the description. You're making us all sick." "Thank you, George," said Mrs. Ribble. "Now, Melvin, why don't you tell us all what happened to you?" "Well," said Melvin, "I tried to combine myself with a bionic robot last night, but I accidentally sneezed at the last second." "So you got combined with a robot and buggers?" asked George. "Yeah," said Melvin. "But don't worry, I'm building a separate now 1000, which will reserve the effects and turn me back into a boy again. It will just take 6 months to finish." "6 months," said Harold. "Hey, cellular separation is a highly complex procedure," said Melvin. "It's not like building a robot. It takes time." "You should try taking the batteries out of the combiner thing and putting them in backwards," suggested George. "That might reverse the effect." Melvin rolled his thick, bubbling, crust-covered infrared eyeballs. "That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard," he gurgled. Chapter 15. The New Melvin. You might think that turning into a bionic booger boy was the worst thing that could ever happen to a kid, but it wasn't at all. Believe it or not, there was actually a positive side to being a lumbering loogie lad. For instance, Melvin now won every football game he played because no one wanted to tackle him. And when he served a volleyball, nobody on the other team would dare to hit the ball back. Besides being the school's new sports star, there were other perks too. Melvin never had to wait in line at the drinking fountain anymore. Now he had his own personal drinking fountain because, well, would you use drinking fountain after a bionic booger boy had globbered all over it? I didn't think so. All of the special attention that Melvin was receiving made some of the other kids a little jealous, but not George and Harold. Considering the many evil violence that George and Harold had been battling all year, the two boys were just grateful that Melvin hadn't turned himself into a giant terrifying beast with plans to destroy the earth. "It could be a lot worse," said Harold. "At least Melvin's not a terrifying evil villain." "Yeah, you're right," said George. "I can't think of anything that couldn't turn Melvin into a terrifying evil." Chapter 16. The Cold and Flu Season. So, it was autumn, and the new season brought with it many changes. Crisp, chilly air, early morning frost, and bright, colorful leaves. But with the beauty of autumn came another change that wasn't quite so welcome: the cold and flu season. All through Jeremy Horwitz Elementary School, people were getting sick. The hallways were filled with runny noses, sneezing mouths, and itching bodies. And unfortunately, one of those noses, mouths, and bodies belonged to Melvin Sneedly. Every time Melvin sneezed, thousands of tiny dribbles shot off his mouth, spattering the chalkboard with a thin layer of foamy, glistening yellowish-green tepid like muscus. "Don't forget to cover your mouth, Melvin, dear," said Mrs. Ribble. "Oh, sorry," said Melvin. "Sorry." He put his hand over his mouth and sneezed again. This time the explosion of air from his stiff sneeze blew off large, wet globs of his body, which sprayed over the entire classroom. It was as if somebody set off a giant firecracker inside a bucket green paint. The warm, smelly goo smacked into people's hair, splattered on their clothes, and seemed to drench every square centimeter of the room. "1 second thoughts, Melvin," said Mr. Ribble. "Don't cover your mouth next time. Now, who wants a cookie?" Chapter 17. The Field Trip. The next day, for some strange reason, Mrs. Ribble was off sick with a cold. Mr. Krupp was falling in as a substitute teacher, and as usual he was very angry. "What the heck is going on in this room?" he yelled. "What's with all the raincoats and umbrellas?" Then Melvin sneezed. A few moments later, Mr. Krupp returned to the classroom with fresh clothes, a raincoat, and an umbrella. "All right, everybody," he shouted. "Today is field trip day. Miss Antrophy and I are taking you all to Snoddybroo's tissue factory to see how blow rags are made." The word tissue made Melvin jump. "No," he cried in panic. "Me no like tissues." An eerie silence fell over the classroom. Everybody looked at Melvin in shock. "Did Melvin just say me no like tissues?" asked Harold. "Yeah," said George. "I've never heard him misuse an objective pronoun before. Who does he think he is? Frankenstein?" Chapter 18. Things Get Bad. In a few hours, the fourth graders were all packed into a hot, stinky factory listening to a boring speech about how trees are turned into tissues. Or something like that. Nobody was paying attention, really except for Melvin Sneedly, who was terrified. His whole body shook and shimmered as the tour took them down to the narrow walkways of the noise industrial plant. Finally, the tour ended at the gift shop, where the plant manager, Mr. Snoody, had a surprise for everybody. "Behind this red curtain with black dots on it," said Mr. Snoody, "is a free gift for each of you." Mr. Snoody pulled back the curtain to reveal a pile of sample tissue packs. "Help yourself," said Mr. Snoody. "There's enough for everybody." "No," screamed Melvin. "Me not like tissues." "Oh, don't be silly," said Mr. Snoddy. "Everybody loves tissues. And our tissues are extra absorbent. They really help to whip out pligen and muscles." "No," screamed Melvin again. "Tissues are bad magic." "Nonsense," laughed Mr. Snoddy. He tossed a couple of sample tissues back at Melvin. "Here you go, young man," he said. "Enjoy." The tissue plaques flipped through the air and stuck on Melvin's back. Melvin screamed. His eyes began to glow green as he beat his chest in anger. Suddenly, Melvin's shoulders started to bubble. His chest expanded. The flexochronomatic steel in Melvin's endoskeleton flexed and grew. His neck and head widened and his body swelled to a height of 4 meters. Melvin grabbed the tissue packs in the massive dripping fingers and flung them to the ground. "Don't make me angry," Melvin warned. "You no like me when I angry." "Oops," said Mr. Snoddy. "You dropped your tissue packs, young fellow. Here's some more for you." Mr. Snoddy grabbed 2 giant handfuls of sample tissue packs and tossed them at Melvin. Chapter 19. Things Get Better. Frantically, Melvin swatted at the 9 new tissue packs stuck to his upper torso as if there were a swarm of stinging bumblebees. He stamped his giant spiked feet and thrashed about violently as his hulking body troubled, then tripled in size. Melvin kicked and punched the walls of the gift shop as he let out the terrifying, blood-curdling cry. "There's no need to cry, little man," said Mr. Snoddy. "Here, have some more tissues to dry those tears." He tossed several more sample tissue packs at Melvin. As you might have noticed by now, Mr. Snoddy wasn't exactly the brightest bulb on the Hanukkah tree. What happened next could only be described as chaos. Once again, Melvin's massive body tripled in size. By now, Melvin was roaring and kicking and knocking over giant machines. Children screamed and ran. Mr. Snoddy saw it might help matters if he could just give Melvin some more tissues. But before he could, a drop of mucus the size of a bath tube dripped from Melvin's massive nose and splashed down on Mr. Snoddy, gluing him to the floor. George and Harold hid behind the red curtain with black dots on its. Melvin crashed through the roof of the factory. Ear-piercing roars bellowed of this giant oozing mouth as he kicked down the walls of the factory and tossed heavy machinery in the parking lot. Mr. Krupp and Miss Antrophy tried their best to get the situation under control, but they weren't having any much luck. "Hey, Bob," shouted Mr. Krupp, "I've had just about enough of your shining dents. You're gonna be spending the afternoon in dentation if you don't settle down, young man," shouted Miss Antrophy. Suddenly, Melvin reached down and grabbed Miss Antrophy in his massive metal fist. "Help me," she screamed. "Somebody save me." Said Mr. Krupp nervously. I will go get some help." Mr. Krupp ran and hid with George and Harold behind the red curtain with black dots on it. "Hey, I thought you were going to get some help," said Harold. "Well, not today," said Mr. Krupp. "You know," said George, "there's only one person who can help Miss Antrophy now." "And who's that?" asked Mr. Krupp. Chapter 20. Captain Underpants. That's who. As much as George and Harold hated to do it, they decided that it was time to send in Captain Underpants to save the day. George snapped his fingers. Suddenly, the terror and panic that Mr. Krupp had been experienced completely vanished. A wild, silly grin spread across his face as he leaped to his feet and ripped off his outer clothing and toupee. Mr. Krupp's transformation into Captain Underpants was almost complete. The only thing he missed was the cape. "Gee," he said, "I sure wish I could find a red curtain with black dots on it." "Hey," said George, as he pointed to the red curtain with the black dots on it. "Here's a red curtain with black dots on it." "What a remarkable, unexpected coincidence," said Captain Underpants, as he grabbed the latest in a series of convoluted plot devices and tied it around his neck. By this time, Melvin had stomped his way out of the factory and into downtown area, leaving behind a twisted path of mucus-coated destruction. Captain Underpants flew into the air, following the trail of terror until he was face to face with the snot-spewing cyborg. "I order you stop," said Captain Underpants, "in the name of all that is pre-shrunk and cottony." Melvin did not listen. Captain Underpants had no choice but to fight the boogery beneath, but first he needed to save Miss Antrophy. Quickly, our hero flew to Edith's side, grabbed her hands and pulled firmly. The slimy flank that covered Melvin's giant fist was strong and gluey, but it was not much for veggie power. Captain Underpants pulled and pulled until Mr. Antrophy became completely disblocked with a noise, wet, disgusting sound. Note: please feel free to make the noise, wet, disgusting sound of your choice to embrace the intense drama of the gripping paragraph. "I'm free!" cried Miss Antrophy. "Let's get the heck out of here." Suddenly, the bionic booger boy reached down and grabbed Captain Underpants by the cape. The monster held on tightly with his giant, gooey, robotic fingers. "Oh," cried Captain Underpants, "he's got my cape! He's got my cape!" "Well, just untie it," screamed Miss Antrophy. "Let's go, let's go!" "But I can't fight crime without my cape," cried Captain Underpants. "Forget your stupid cape," Edward screamed. "Just save me, you idiot." Chapter 21. You can't have your cape and add it too. As anybody will tell you, no superhero is completely without a cape. I mean, without a cape, a superhero is just a guy wearing fancy underwear, or in this case, not so fancy underwear. But Captain Underpants knew what had to be done. He reached up with his free hand and courageously untied his cape, valiantly sacrificing his aesthetic integrity to save the life of a mere mortal being. Captain Underpants and Miss Antrophy were not free, but they weren't safe yet. The bionic booger boy swung at our hero with all his might. Captain Underpants waved around Melvin's frantic flying, plicking, flinging fists as he tried to find a safe place to land. Suddenly, Captain Underpants' 100% cotton power visit spotted George and Harold miles away. With lightning speed, he flew down to meet the boys. "George and Harold," said Captain Underpants, "you've got to keep this woman safe while I destroy the robotic slime ball." "Okay," said Harold, "but hurry up. Here he comes." "Wait," cried Miss Antrophy. I didn't get a chance to say thank you." She turned and kissed Captain Underpants all over his face, wet. Thank you, she said, between each sloppy kiss. "Yuck," said Harold. "I sure hope she don't thank us," said George. When Miss Antrophy had finished slobbering all over Captain Underpants' face, she gave him a great big hug for good luck. "Now, go get him, Tiger," she said coldly. But Captain Underpants didn't move. He just stood there, strangling blankly into place. Off in the distance, George and Harold could hear the bionic booger boy approaching. Each thundering footstep brought the horrible beast closer and closer, until at last he stood towering above them, panting heavily and reeking profoundly. Miss Antrophy screamed and ran away. "Hurry, Captain Underpants," cried Harold. "Do something." "Yeah," cried George. "Kick his backside." But Captain Underpants didn't move. He didn't fight. He didn't fly. He didn't kick anybody's backside. In fact, the only thing he did was to get very, very angry. "What the hell is going on here, boobs?" he screamed. "And why I'm standing here in my underwear?" George and Harold didn't like the sound of that. Chapter 22. Welcome back, Crupper. If you read the comic on page 7 of this novel, then you know what happens whenever Captain Underpants gets water in her hand. Unfortunately, Miss Antrophy's wet, slobbery kisses had produced the same effect. Captain Underpants had been turned back into Mr. Krupp, and now he was about to be turned into lunch. Quickly, George and Harold began frantically snapping their fingers. Again and again and again they snapped, but Mr. Krupp's face was still slimy and wet with gooey kisses juice, and the snaps were having no effect at all. The mighty mucus monster shoved Mr. Krupp into his gummy mouth and swallowed him whole. And then he came after George and Harold. "Help!" screamed George. "We're doomed!" Chapter 23. Zulu saved the day. Halfway across the city, a plucky little hamster with the bionic ears heard the terrified cries of his two best pals. Quickly, Zulu jumped out of his exercise wheel and crashed through the side of his plastic cage. Then, with a mighty leap, he bounded from the window of George Harold treehouse. At the very moment, Melvin was dangling George and Harold high above the mouse. "Ha!" laughed the bionic booger boy. "Me got you at least." "Well, goodbye, Harold," said George. "See you later, Paul." It was fun while it lasted. Finally, Melvin let go of George and Harold. The two boys screamed as they fell face first into the gooey, gaping mouths of the swoosh. The next thing George and Harold knew, they were flying sideways at an incredible speed. Everything around them was a blur of motion, except for the sight of their little buddy Zulu, who had literally grabbed them from the murky mouth of the death at the very last second. "Attaboy!" cried George. "Hooray for Zulu!" Zulu set George and Harold down on the roof as distant building, then returned to the scene of the crime. He grabbed a few oversized novelty items from the top of some warehouses and turned to face his mortal enemy. Chapter 14. The Incredible Graphic Violence Chapter Part 2. Warning. The following stunts were performed on closed streets by a highly trained professional hamster. To avoid injury, please do not grab oversized novelty items from the tops of warehouses and beat up giant monsters with them. Cane tops keep falling on my head. Yummy, yummy, I got love in my tummy. A hard day's bite. Chapter 25. How to reverse the effects of a Combine Otron 2000 in one easy step. The bionic booger boy was defeated. He flopped unconscious into a giant booger blob that spread across several city blocks, and nearly 4 whole pages are reports surrounded his massive fusing body. Soon, Melvin's mother and father showed up with the Combinotron 2000. "We saw what was happening on the news set, and we want the world to know that we are going to create a new machine that will reverse the process that turned our son into this monster. If we work together, it should only take a few months to build. Why don't you guys just take the batteries out of the Combino thingy and switch them around?" said George. "Wouldn't that reserve the machine's effect?" "Well, Lord Melvin, father, obviously you don't know anything about science, little boy. You can't expect to reserve the effects of highly complex calculum moleculings combinotron just by a switch the batteries around. That type of thing only happens in Obernick's children books." Said George self-consciously. "Well, why don't you just give it a try?" "All right," said Mr. Sneedle, rolling his eyes and smirking. He quickly switched the batteries around and powered up the machine. "But I'm only doing this to prove a point to the you kids. It's not gonna work. No way. Not in a million years. And anybody who thinks it might is a completely idiot. It goes against the popular laws of logic and science. He aimed the nearly reconfused Combinotron 2000 at his son and fired. Chapter 26. Blast. Suddenly, there was a terrific explosion. The bionic Booger Boy burst into 3 huge chunks of glistening snot and twisted metal, which smacked on the 3 nearby buildings and stuck like glue. In the center of the explosion, surrounded by smoke, stood Mr. Krupp and Melvin. "Well, what you don't know," said Mr. Sneedle, "my idea worked." George and Harold rolled their eyes. "Now, step aside, kiddies," said Mrs. Needle, as the 2 scientists marched off to tell the roboters all about their brilliant and inspirational scientific breakthrough. But as the smoke around Mr. Krupp and Melvin began to clear, it became obvious that they were not quite back to normal. Apparently, the newly reconfigured Combinotron had accidentally morphed Mr. Krupp and Melvin together. "Don't worry," Mr. Sneedle told the reporters. "All I need to do is a zap, then one more. That should set everything straight." He fired up the Combinotron 2000 again and prepared to blast away. "I sure hope they separate these boys," said George. "Me too," said Harold. Zzzt. Chapter 27. To make a long story short. It did. Chapter 28. A happy ending. "You know something," said George. "This is the first time one of our books actually had a happy ending." "You're right," said Harold. "Usually they end with screaming, 'Oh no,' and me screaming, 'Here we go again.' But we got lucky this time, I guess." "What do you mean, lucky?" said Mr. Krupp. "It was my invention that saved the world. You guys are so immature." "Huh?" said George. "I want to see both of you bubs in my office pronto," jailed Melvin. "I'm gonna punish you boys so bad your kids will be born with detentions." "What?" said Harold. Suddenly, a giant extendable octoclaw reached out from one of the 3 huge chunks of boogers. It grabbed the Combinotron out of Mr. Sneedle's hand and smashed it to between and the ground. Mr. and Mrs. Sneedle ran away screaming as the 3 humongous robotic booger chunks came to life. Slowly, they began dripping down the sides of the building, each one energizing itself with a single twin-turbo 9000 SP5 Kung-Fu titanium lithium alu processor. As the huge booger chunks used closer and closer, they began sprouting strange-looking metallic eyeballs and huge mannequin robot limbs. Suddenly, the 3 ridiculous robo-boogers leaped together: George, Harold, Zulu, and Mr. Krupp and Melvin. And the chase was on. "Oh no," screamed George. "Here we go again." This was the 6th epic novel by Delph Palki. If you like this, I can just recommend you to check out all the other novel books I have from Captain Underpants. I started with the first novel and now I'm at the 6th. It is very new for me to read books in comic style. It is not that easy because sometimes it is weird to read the comics itself, but it also have long written language, so it is a good mix of both that it makes actually sense. I don't know if you have any thoughts and ideas about comics I actually can read who make absolutely sense in ASMR, but maybe you know one, just write it down in the comment. I really want to know if there is also just some straight comic books I can read easily and good in ASMR style. Because I think you have to read it by yourself most of the time to understand and to see all the details inside of the book. But I have 2 cameras and I try my best to make it possible for you to enjoy the ASMR sound of my voice and to see the illustrations made by Delph Palki. If you not already did, feel free to follow me everywhere in the World Wide Web, because here is my playground, and this ASMR YouTube channel is just one of all the things and hard projects I create. So, if you not already did, check me out in the World Wide Web. See the description under the video to find all the other stuff I do when you get curious. Also feel free to follow and to subscribe here to my ASMR YouTube channel and come with me together on the adventure of sound, because I really love to show you the minimalistic and amazing experience of ASMR. I not only read books, I have different amazing clips about the joy of sound, share it with friends, food and mukbang, sweets, and also some philosophic and personal stories from me for you in ASMR style. So I wish you a pleasant time, and I hope I see you to the next novel episode from Captain Underpants. And I also would be very lucky when you check out all my other clips and support me with your comments. No matter where you are in the world right now, enjoy your time, relax, and I hope you have an amazing day, night, morning, or whatever time is right now at your